Hey folks, welcome to a portfolio review at Finominal. Today we're going to look at JP Morgan's strategic aggressive ETF model portfolio. Now, the aggressive refers to this portfolio being basically all equities, so it provides exposure to global equities. And if we look at the portfolio in terms of underlying holdings, we do see that it is comprised exclusively of JP Morgan ETFs and I think one mutual fund. The largest allocation with 37% is to US equity, followed by international equity, and by an allocation to a value ETF. The auto-suggested benchmark from our side is the MSCI World Index, which kind of makes sense for a global equities portfolio. And we can look at the performance of this model portfolio versus the MSCI World Index since 2023. And as we can see, well, they look almost identical. The JP Morgan portfolio has slightly underperformed. Having said that, this is the performance of the current portfolio and not the actual tracker book. But we can go to the website of JP Morgan and we can go all the way to the bottom. Usually it's not a good sign if performance is at the far bottom. It's usually like being hidden. And what we can see over here is that the performance since launch in 2021 was an annual return of 10.5% versus 11.7% for the benchmark selected by JP Morgan. Stated differently, the portfolio has underperformed its benchmark by more than 1% per annum, which is not great. So let's investigate in terms of how JP Morgan is building this portfolio, and we're going to kick off with a short sector overview. So here we see the exposure, the overweights and underweights versus the benchmark, which in our case is the MSCI World Index. JP Morgan, by the way, has the same benchmark. They got like 98% MSCI World and 2% cash, which is pretty much the same thing. And we do see the only meaningful difference is that JP Morgan's portfolio has an underweight to the tech sector with negative 2.6%. Now, it's kind of interesting to think about where that is coming from, and we can switch to a returns-based factor exposure analysis. From an asset class perspective, it is all equities. Having said that, we do see very consistent factor betas to equity factors. We do see there is this tilt towards the value factor, right? There is the tilt towards momentum, and the tilt towards value also explains the underweight technology stocks, because technology stocks tend to be expensive, and this portfolio has a tilt, underweight technologies sector, bias towards the value factor. That's what's the same. It's the same effect effectively. And we also see kind of like negative betas to low volatility factor, quality, and the size factor. Now, this is with regards to factor betas. The kind of next question is if this portfolio has been constructed sensibly. And if we go back to the holdings, what we do see here is, US equity, fine, international equity, then we see value and growth. And this is where the alarm clocks should be starting to ring, because value and growth are the opposite factor exposures. We also see, by the way, that there is a global select equity ETF, right? So I'm kind of curious how global is different to US plus international, right? But let's just focus on value versus growth, because this highlights the problem of this portfolio, as well as many other ones that we see, that funds are being combined that provide opposing factor exposures and that effectively are netting themselves off. And we can quickly look at this in terms of a short holdings analysis. So if you look at the active growth ETF, we see that it is providing a beta to the value factor of negative 0.7. Makes sense. These are growth stocks, expensive stocks. But then I got the active value ETF, and I have a positive beta of 0.09. But if you combine negative with positive, right, you're just netting things off. And effectively what you're left with is expensive diluted equity, which is the same thing as US equity again. or the global select equity ETF. So that doesn't make any sense. We can also ask the question if we can reduce fees. And the overall cost of this portfolio is around, I think, 19 basis points, which is very cost competitive, to be fair, JPMorgan. And we can have a quick look if we want to replace any of the holdings with passive benchmarks, right? So for example, the JPMorgan Active Builders Emerging Markets ETF is charging 35 basis points. We could replace that with a product from BNI Mellon, which is charging, well, 11 basis points, right? And if you look at that on a portfolio level, if we do all these replacements, you can reduce cost from 19 basis points to 8 basis points, and you get an identical performance. So what's not to like? The final question we're going to ask ourselves is, can we simplify this portfolio? And this portfolio has, I think, 7 securities. And indeed, we could replicate that basically with three securities, which is just a product from Vanguard, Total World Stock Index, MSCI World, and the Russell 1000 ETF, which effectively would lead to a simplified portfolio that has 3 securities, which is easier to think from an allocation perspective. You would reduce fees from 19 basis points to 15, right? And actually, well, your Sharpe ratio would have been improved. Having said this, you could, instead of taking these 3 securities, you could simply also just go for the MSCI World, because as we saw earlier using benchmarking perspective, that's pretty much the same performance. And this concludes our short analysis of JPMorgan's strategic asset aggressive ETF model portfolio. As mentioned, there are funds in here that are overlapping. Now, we do understand why JPMorgan is doing this. They want to show a little bit of expertise, right, in terms of just adding funds, also ones that have higher fees, right? But practically, that just doesn't make any sense. As you can see from performance perspective, what you're ending up with, again, is just the MSCI World Index. Hope that helps. Have a nice day.